Hey guys, what's up? It's Paul Salazar over at Hilton Highland Real Estate. I have a great guest. His name is David Lee with Fame Architecture and Design. I have known David for the last couple years, and today we're going to be talking about the Wildlife Ordinance. It's a very hot topic in real estate, especially in the boundary areas that it affects. David, welcome. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, man. Good to see you.
You too. I've known you for a couple years now. You obviously you do architecture and design, and I think you're the right person to discuss this because when you're looking at designing a new home in this area right now compared to maybe 6 months from now, it's gonna be two different things, correct?
Super different. So some brief background for the Wildlife Ordinance is that the first draft was proposed back in 2021. So this has actually been ongoing for a number of years. And then 18 months ago, it was heavily talked about. It seemed like the city was going to adopt it. And then they hit the snooze button for the last 18 months. And then now, since basically November, it's come back online. So we anticipate it to be adopted early this year. Best guesses right now is sometime in March, but that is always in flux.
Okay, so let's talk about the area that it affects.
Yeah.
It's the Santa Monica Mountains, but it's between the 405, the 101.
Yep, east of the 405, west of the 101, north of Sunset and Hollywood, and then south of like Valley Vista. So all the Santa Monica Mountain region, if your property is within that zone, if this ordinance is passed, it would apply to those properties. That would be considered the new wildlife district.
And it includes all areas in terms of like, because most of that is all city of LA, right? But some of it is city of Beverly Hills.
Yeah, it includes anything within that zone. And there's a map that maybe we can stick in here. That's where it would be applied to. Yeah.
Okay. So these areas include some parts of Bel Air, some parts of Beverly Hills, some parts of Beverly Hills Post Office, which is city of LA. So is Bel Air, city of LA. You got Hollywood Hills, Studio City, Sherman Oaks. So it's a big area.
It's a really big area, and it's the ordinance, the drafts of the ordinance, which is available online if anyone is interested in reading a 30-page document. There's some things in there that I think make sense given the title of this ordinance of wildlife. And there is some things too that probably don't make much sense for the topic of wildlife, but they would impact homeowners and developers for sure. So it's been a highly contested, like you said, hot topic, a highly contested proposal in the last few years.
Yeah. So let's talk about who this affects. I mean, obviously it's going to affect the homeowners, but it's also going to affect anybody who's looking to develop. And this is a very, we're talking about development in this area. We're talking about mega mansions, right?
Yeah. Yep.
So let's talk about, building a house now compared to building it after the Wildlife Ordinance gets put into effect.
So first of all, the regulations only apply if you're doing a certain type of project, right? And there's I think 4 or 5 different types of criteria that would make you qualify under these new regulations. The first is if you're doing a new construction project that's 500 square feet or larger, then all these regulations would apply to you. The second is if you're doing an addition that's 500 square feet or bigger, the same thing applies to you. And if you're doing a remodel on a hillside where the aggregate cost of the remodel exceeds 50% of what it would cost to just replace the house, then you are underneath these regulations. And there's some additional ones too. If you grade, that's you cut soil and remove soil by a certain amount, then you qualify, or these regulations would be applied to you. And also trees. I think if you remove any valuable trees and things like that, then the regulations apply. If you're just doing reconstruction work that's due to like natural disasters, that doesn't count. So that's not part of kind of that criteria.
That's interesting you say that because I recall at some point when that was actually part of it, but they took it out?
I believe they took it out. Yeah, I believe they took it out. I'd have to triple check the recent draft, but that's that's not part of it anymore. Yeah, those don't count as part of the 4 or 5 things that I mentioned.
Okay, got it. And the people that are pro Wildlife Ordinance, they're looking out for birds and wildlife that are walking across the mountains, correct?
Yeah, that's that's the premise of it, right? So there are some things in the document that make total sense. They specify a whole long list of plant species that are preferred, a lot of which, or maybe all of which, are native. There's also things like light pollution. You don't want to have too much light bleeding out from the houses at night that disturbs the nocturnal animals. And there's even a regulation in there that talks about how much glazing you have. Uninterrupted glazing, which is a problem for birds, because if you have big glass over certain distances or areas, birds will crash into them. So there are things, and there's more things like that in this proposed ordinance that make sense and do talk about wildlife. The part where it gets kind of funky is there's essentially two or three things. First is that this effectively limits you to only 1,000 cubic yards of grading before additional reviews are needed. And you always want to avoid these additional reviews. And this is a huge thing, especially in these areas in the mountains where we have hillsides where large amounts of grading are often required. The second limitation, and this is a big one, is that it limits construction and the RFA, which is residential floor area, to only 6,000 square feet. So all of the big mansions, which are above 6,000 square feet, usually on the magnitude of 9, 10, 12 above, you're limited to 6. And then lastly, too, there's an ordinance or an aspect of the ordinance which talks about basements. And as you know, in the LA hillsides, a lot of these large houses, a basement in LA is not really a traditional basement like you might think about in the Midwest. The basement in LA is your bottom level of your house, and it's a daylit basement that functions as a party space, as a lounge, as a living room, as any other part of the house. And basements currently are exempt from RFA calculations, right? So all properties right now are limited to how much you can build, which makes sense. But basements are not included in those calculations right now. When this ordinance passes, a good portion of those basements would now count toward the RFA. So the ordinance would allow up to only 1,000 square feet of basement to be built, excluded from the calculation, but anything beyond that counts toward the calculation. So not only are you limited to 6,000 square feet of RFA total, anything above 1,000 square feet in your basement, which 1,000 square feet is like not very large, counts toward your RFA. And there's some other kind of smaller things in there, but those are the three biggest ones, which are significant.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably what most homeowners and most real estate agents are a little bit worried about, is that property values are going to go down drastically for those houses that are considered development opportunities for future buyers.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So those homeowners are really affected because when they go to sell in a few years from now, and this wildlife ordinance is in place, now their property is worth much less. So you're saying that the maximum amount that you can build, regardless of how large a lot is, it could be a 2-acre lot, flat lot, which I don't know if that even exists, but I mean, I'm sure there's a couple of those, right? You cannot build more than 6,000 square feet.
I think technically it's 5,999 because I think the language is 6,000 or more triggers this additional review. So let me be clear also, if this passes, yes, you in theory could build beyond that, but it's just very, very unlikely for most people. And you'd be in it for an extremely long haul. So and at that point, a lot of times it doesn't really make sense for like the average person. You know, of course, if you're talking about someone who owns multiple acres and they're combining lots and whatnot, then it's a different kind of territory in the upper stratosphere. But for everyone else, those are the numbers that you would have to keep in mind. It's 6,000 square feet limited, and the basement, again, anything beyond 1,000 square feet now counts towards the RFA. Okay.
So give us an example of, I know that you've been talking to people that live in Bel Air or in this area that is in the ordinance. Tell us, give us an example of something that you're working on currently, and you can use ballpark numbers of what you can construct now compared to what you can construct in 6 months from now.
Well, that would be the biggest difference. So right now you can build much, much bigger than that. So a lot that we were looking at recently in Bel Air, we were after preliminary studies of what could be built based on all the regulations. And as you know, in Los Angeles, a lot of these hillside properties are not simple. So taking a step back, right? A lot of folks, a lot of clients think, well, let me send you an address and give me an exact number of what I can build. It's not that simple because we have to calculate the grading and a bunch of other things. But anyway, for this property in Bel Air, we were seeing that we could build about 10,000 square feet currently. But if this passes come March or whenever, then you can only build 6 plus the little bit of basement and then an ADU as well, which all those things help add to the overall square footage, but they're categorically not the same thing as what we all can do now and what we think of when we think about Hollywood Hills, Bel Air, and all these places, right? We think about these really large, luxurious, awesome houses. If this happens, it's going to be like a historical shift to the landscape of all the houses in these areas. And so any property that has currently built a house that is of that scale that we've been talking about, or the homeowner has the rights to build it, which we can talk about in a second, you will have a project that is kind of the older era that will be phased out if this comes to pass. Because from 6 to 10, that's a massive, it's different. It's
completely different. Yeah.
It's completely different from from a real estate standpoint, from a buyer standpoint, from the clientele, like who's buying those houses, a lifestyle standpoint, from a design standpoint. They're fundamentally different things. And so this is a kind of a seismic shift if it takes place.
Yeah, no, for sure. So that makes me think that the larger houses in these areas will be, obviously worth probably even more money because they're already built and you can't rebuild them.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And then now maybe developers are going to start looking in other areas like Brentwood, Palisades. But are those areas, are they next? Because those are also in the Santa Monica Mountains.
Yeah, that is a super, super good question, which I don't have the answer to. And I also want to be clear that this ordinance, again, it's been talked about for a number of years. And it does seem like now, finally, it is going to pass. But it's still an if, right? So is there a chance that it's not going to pass come March or April, or it's definitely not going to pass in February, I don't think. But let's say come March or April. Yeah, there's a chance, right? And obviously with an ordinance like this, amongst the professional communities, the architecture and construction communities that we're a part of, there's a lot of public outcry, which is trying to change some of the language. And that might be successful. It also might not. So we're sort of, the homeowners, I think, and developers are sort of in the situation where it is, what's that physics analogy, Schrodinger's cat, the box, where like the cat is alive and dead at the same time in the box because we don't know. Yeah. We're kind of in that state, right? Like this could not pass and we'd be fine. Or it could pass, and then if you're banking on being able to build that large amount of square footage, that's gone. It's out the window.
Yeah, it's like ULA in a way, the big mansion tax.
Yeah,
everybody was like, "Oh, it hasn't passed yet," but we kind of had a feeling it was going to pass.
Yeah,
I think the feeling is kind of mutual with this. It's like we're all very scared of it because it's going to change the landscape of this area, and this is prime Los Angeles area.
Yeah,
where developers are spending millions and then not only that, but the tax dollars that the city is going to make on all these big mega mansions is going to be much less.
That's actually that's a good point.
So it's also like the city is also being affected by this as well.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. I mean, my thinking is that. So this is the challenge of trying to guess what's going to take place. And because we're involved in these networks, we know people who are in the offices and we hear things. But it really comes down to the folks who are making the decision, and it's hard to play a mind-reading game. I personally think that if you are serious about building a house of that scale, or at least getting the permits for that, right? And you're going to do it within the shorter term period of time. You're not talking about guessing that you might do it 20 years from now, but you're going to do it. Then I would start now. I don't see any reason not to start now, because you're just hedging your bets, right? And if it passes, then you're golden. Now you're holding a golden ticket because you're one of a handful, let's say, of properties, newer properties that have this ability to build big. And if it does pass, then so what? So you started a little bit earlier than you were going to, right? And you know, if come March it doesn't pass, it doesn't mean that it still won't take place 2 months later. So that's kind of, you know, assuming that the person has all their finances in line and all that stuff, because this is big money. That's the mentality I would take for sure.
So I'm assuming that you're seeing, and a bunch of your other, you know, architect friends are seeing a lot of more inquiries about, hey, let's see what we can do now, right? Before this thing passes.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's our job to inform all of our clients and prospective clients of what's going on and keep them up to date, which we do. And we advise them, we let them know what the facts are, and it's up to them to make their decision. But yes, amongst the professionals, all the call them the usual suspects amongst the architects, not the contractors so much, but the architects, engineers, civil engineers, surveyors, all these people, they all know the game, and everyone's doing one or two of these expedited tracks, permit tracks right now to get their clients in and have the project vested before this ordinance takes place. So December was kind of stressful for everybody because of the holidays and because everyone had a few projects that they were trying to slam in.
Yeah. Okay. So if I want to understand, if you are trying to build more than 6,000 square feet, what does that process look like? Obviously, you'd have to go talk to the board and just get like a variance on it. Is that what it's going to be like?
It's basically like that, yes. And I believe the language is such that it would also allow neighbors to be involved in the review process. So the way I would describe it is it's kind of like opening a can of worms. All right, you could tackle it and it could be done. It's going to take a long time, and there's a pretty good chance it might not, because the purpose of the ordinance is to not allow houses to be built above a certain size. And now you're asking for that. So you have to prove that you should be allowed to build beyond that when they've created this whole thing and spent a lot of money on research and whatnot to put this in place. And it's just, if it was me, I wouldn't count on that path as a way, you know, to do it. If I was serious about building or permitting and I was sort of ready to at least take a first step right now.
Do you have any indication on why there was not some type of percentage change? Because, you know, as you know, the larger the property, the larger the flat pad, the more valuable it is because you can build more, right? And this is not taking that into consideration. So now, let's just say we have a house that's 10,000 square feet of lot, right? And we have one that's 1 acre, and you can build the same house on it. Obviously, the one that's 1 acre will be worth more because you have more land, but you can't build a bigger house on that 1 acre house.
Yeah.
It just seems strange that there was no percentage change. Do you have any thoughts on that? Why they would do that?
No, the why, I definitely don't have any answers. Except that I think the question you're asking is the same one that we are all asking. Yeah. The same thing too with limiting the basement size, which is, you know, having daylit basements and the way that is described previously for houses is part of LA architecture and their homes. That's like having a front door, you have a daylit basement, that's what you do. And so there are a lot of folks who would ask that same question and ask the question of, well, can you tell me exactly what wildlife we are trying to preserve by not allowing me to build a basement under a house that already exists? I'm already grading a flat part. Why not just let me dig out to put stuff underneath it? And it's kind of anyone's guess. And I think before, if I'm not mistaken, about 18 months ago, it wasn't 6,000 square feet, it was 7,500. I'm pretty sure that was the case, and it's dropped. So there's definitely some people that have some thoughts about the areas of square footages of things, and a lot of people in our communities, you know, in real estate by extension, are curious as to the logic behind it, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think my initial thought on the logic of at least the maximum size of the house is that you have more land for the wildlife to roam around in, right? But I think for the most part, like, people have their places fenced off, and there's not a lot of wildlife going inside the house, you know?
I know.
So, I mean, look, I guess we're like beating a dead bush by trying to like answer these questions that don't really make sense, you know? Let's talk about, there's okay, we talked about how it's going to impact developers.
Yeah.
I know one of the big things a year ago or a year and a half ago was the fact that if a house burned down, you couldn't build the same house. But you're saying that that's not on the table anymore.
No, I mean, so the regulations apply again to the 4 or 5 criteria of if you're doing new construction over 500 square feet, additions over 500, and then remodels that exceed a certain aggregate construction cost compared to if you build new. But if something were to be burned down or torn down or demolished or devastated by natural disasters, that's not part of the calculation. And that kind of makes sense. I mean, there are plenty of other rules and regulations in the current code and the code that would continue with this ordinance that allows for exceptions for things to be grandfathered in, as we would say. So when you have and even, this is not directly answering your question, but we have a non-conforming condition, you can usually leave a wall there. So if a house has a portion that's built beyond a setback and it's been that way, then you can leave it there but you can't do any more of that, which sometimes produces odd conditions to design around.
Yeah. So is this going to be something like the Coastal Commission or like the Mulholland Corridor area, where you have to, like, when you're getting a permit in these areas in the future, once this is, passed, you have to go through that process with the wildlife ordinance people? Okay.
Yep, exactly. And you won't be able to get any of your permits until at least this lens of the wildlife ordinance and that layer of approval has happened. Okay. So you can't pull a planning or a building permit without this going through that process. So I do expect that. It's hard to say with city governments, but I do expect that it will cause permitting to take longer, especially if you're at the cusp of doing any of the projects that I kind of described, that it's going to take longer. And for sure, if you're pushing the envelope of the 6,000 square feet or getting close to it, it's going to raise some eyebrows. And that's just the nature of also when you have new regulation come into place, it takes the city staff, everything takes longer when it first happens, for sure. I think that, again, I would emphasize to homeowners and developers to take that first step and at least secure the rights to build larger if they want to. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they have to commit to doing the whole project like now within the next 2 months. Because once you submit for a permit, and you have to submit a drawing set that's robust and realistic enough to be considered. Once you're in, the project is vested for 18 months. So you have 18 months to either pull a permit or file for an extension. So it's not like because you've decided to pursue, let's say, preserving your right to build larger, that forces you to start construction, in 2 months, or try and do all of your architectural drawings and engineering in the span of 2 months. You still have considerable amount of time to make those decisions, or sell the property with the permit.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's what we're talking about with a lot of our clients that have those types of properties that we consider development opportunities, tear downs. We're saying, hey, let's act fast. Either we sell it now, or if you want to wait to sell it, let's at least get some RTI plans in place. That way we can sell it a year from now.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've talked about this before. So the question, of course, for any homeowner or developer is, okay, if I spend the money to get a permit set, to get permits, do I make that money back if I sell the property? And that's sometimes a tricky, line to balance on. But for the types of properties that I've seen recently, the answer is very likely yes, right? But it's also important for all of these people to know that the amount of time and energy, the amount of time it takes to submit the initial permit set. I'm not talking about getting the permit. I'm talking about just submitting the first set is a lot more work than people think. It takes a couple months. And there's a whole slew, there's about half a dozen individuals you need to hire to get it done. You need an architect, you need a structural engineer, civil engineer, you need a surveyor, a geotechnical engineer or soils engineer, you need a landscape architect, probably MVP, and you would want to use an expediter in most of these cases. And that's a lot of different people to hire and bring on to all expedite, really expedite their work to get it in by the dates that we're describing. So I don't want, there's a chance this might not happen, and I don't want people to feel like they're up against a corner. But again, if the cat is dead or alive, you kind of are, and you're smack out of time. So this is you're at the 11th hour to get it done by, and the reason why it takes that long. Well, the architectural side takes a lot of work, the most work, I would say, but it's also the soils engineers and the surveyor, right? That takes the soils testing takes time. It takes a couple months, and there's not really a lot you can do to expedite that. It just takes how long it takes. So we've met with people, and the problem is too. Everyone is always saying you have to start now in order to get something done by, but usually that really means that you have a couple weeks or a month of squish. And that's not really the case, right? Because everyone says you have to start now. But this is actually the case. Because if it comes to pass in March, then you kind of have to start like this week to make it, for large developments, for sure. Yeah. Because it's a lot of different people to hire, and it's just a lot of moving parts and work to get done to submit a permit set. And the beauty of working with people who are used to doing this path is that permit set you submit, the initial submittal, doesn't have to be the perfect design, right? Because there's no way for, let's say, a 10,000 square foot house that all of these people, especially the architect and designer, can create the perfect house or a 9 out of 10 house in the span of 2 months. It's impossible. But you don't have to do that to get your foot in the door, right? So as long as you submit a good enough set, you're vested and you're good for 18 months. And then you can use that 18 months to sit on it if you want to. You can use that 18 months to pull the permit. You can use that 18 months to finesse the design and get it exactly how you want it, and then pull the permit. You have time. But getting in, that's the key part. Got it. Yeah. So you're saying that once this video launches, it's too late. I gotta launch this video tomorrow. You gotta launch the video tomorrow. And we're always for everybody who's watching, I mean, we're early January. It's January 6th. We're shooting this, probably a little bit too late, but with all of our time stuff, we wanted to get it done, and we still have time for those people that want to look into it. But you're saying that there's not a lot of time. You need to start, if you want to do it now, and at least buy yourself 18 months. At least buy yourself 18 months, and at least know that depending on the property and all those other factors, that the money you sink in for getting a permit will be recouped if you were to sell the property. 100%. Usually a little bit more, but let's say you at least break even. So, aside from initial checks to cut to all the professionals, there's not a whole lot to lose if you can at least sell the property and make that money back. But yeah, all these efforts will be very expedited to get it done in time, for sure. And that's part of the game too. I mean, that's what I'm saying. The professionals that we work with and the teams that we typically put together for this type of project, this fast-tracked, secure and getting a project vested, everyone knows how to work really quickly, professionally, but also very quickly, so we can at least get in and we know what we can revise afterwards, right? Yeah. Because you don't want to do a set that's not good enough to be accepted, otherwise it's a total waste, and you don't want to spend too much time perfecting things and then potentially miss the deadline. Yeah. And the cool thing is about getting your project vested is that the initial set of permit drawings you submit. For, let's say you're a homeowner and you're like, well, I'm really concerned about submitting this drawing set, and then I'm going to be stuck to like this floor plan that I don't like, or this design I don't like. Revising a floor plan of a house is super easy from a permitting perspective. So that all can 100% change after you submit. Even the total area, the square footage of the house can change a little bit. You can increase the size of the permit set in the house by 5% and decrease it if you wanted to decrease it by 10% if you needed to. The rough footprint of the house can also change if you needed to. You could technically even change the entire massing of the house and submit for a revisal if you wanted to. There are limitations to that, because if you submit a circle in the far northeast corner of the site, then you submit a square to the other side, then the city looks at it and says, okay, this is not like a revision, this is a new construction, you get kicked back out of the queue. But the point is that there's a lot of flexibility even after you submit this initial set. Yeah. Okay. So I feel like we've talked a lot about the effects it will have for new construction. You talked about if you're doing a remodel,
So for like current homeowners that have a house that say it's 8,000 square feet, right? If they're doing a major remodel or maybe it's a buyer buying this house that's a massive house, but they're going to have to gut the whole thing and spend millions of dollars redoing it. How are they affected? I know you had talked about that briefly. Are they affected?
That is a really, really good question, which I would have to sort of read between the lines with the ordinance. So technically, yes. So at the scale that you're describing, yes, because the amount of money they would be spending on a remodel would far exceed the half of the cost to rebuild the house as it is. And those types of calculations, I understand why they exist in regulations, but they're tough to follow because construction costs are so high, and doing a remodel is, as anyone in the profession, it's expensive. It's very easy to get past that 50% point. But whether or not the square footage limitations that I've talked about would apply, therefore, is a really good question, and I'd have to double check that. My gut is telling me no, because I cannot. It wouldn't make any sense at all that if you have an 8,000 square foot house, that suddenly you're limited to 6. Yeah.
They're not going to make you make it smaller. Got it. But you just can't expand, obviously, at that point.
Yeah. Correct. Yeah, definitely not.
If you wanted to expand an 8,000 square foot house, you could, but you could only do 500 square feet, or it was like a calculation you said, right?
If you're doing so I'm not quite sure which of the two lines would be triggered first and afterwards, but additions that are over 500 square feet would then come into effect. But if your house is already over the 6,000 square foot limitation, I'm not quite sure how those two come into the mix with each other. It's a good question.
Got it. And if you're within the Mulholland corridor and you have this layer, you have 2 layers of kind of committees you'd have to go through, right, in order to get things passed. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fun.
It's tough. It's getting more and more difficult. So that's why too. Yeah. And we're talking about the wildlife ordinance, but things like updates to the code happen pretty often, right? Not on this magnitude when we talk about RFA, but they do happen pretty often. So even if so what I'm saying is it's pretty common for projects when they're in the process of designing and permitting and all of those things, or say prior to permitting, but in the process of design, to suddenly realize come the new year, there's a new ordinance of some kind or regulation that's going to come into effect. Let's get in as soon as possible. That's part of the game, let's call it. So in some regards, the ordinance itself and the regulations it's proposing are dramatic in a historical lens. At the same time, working quickly again to get your foot in the door is something that anyone who's doing work in these areas has probably done in the past, because it's just part of what takes place. And what you always want to try and do is get in before whatever new changes take place, because it's and the regulations, and this is a larger conversation perhaps, but the regulations are always being added to and becoming more complex. And I don't foresee them becoming simpler, unfortunately. So it's sort of like the sooner you could just get in, like just do that now, and you'll save yourself and everyone else who's doing the project a lot of headache.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I remember when they passed the ULA mansion tax, the amount of sales over $5 and $10 million. The week before, I mean, there was just an incredible spike of sales, and then after that, it was just like dead for 6 months. Yeah, and it just took a while for like people to be okay with it, paying a massive tax. And
I think you brought up a point earlier of there's not a lot of video content or a lot of online discussion about this ordinance compared to the ULA, and it's a really interesting question that. And I'd have to think about as to, why is that the case? I mean, my guess is maybe, tax is a red flag word. You say tax, everyone's going to listen to what? Tax what? And, but a wildlife ordinance is, what does that mean? Oh, it might happen and there might be a square footage limitation. That's hazy. But when you actually read through it, right? And a lot of it, again, makes sense. Trees, and things like this, and birds. But then when you get to certain line items, you're like, what is that right there? The 6,000 square feet. And that's something that should be talked about. Yeah.
And at least in the real estate community, it's being talked about, especially after I think there was like a November, talk with somebody at the city, and some of the reels I saw on Instagram afterwards from agents were pretty mean. I mean, they were going after these city officials because they asked them tough questions, and they were just sitting there like they didn't have an answer to it.
No, I don't think they have an answer. And what happened in November, to your point, was that the city said they were going to pass it in December. They're like, we're going to do it. And then there was so much upheaval, they decided to push it back. But from all the people that we know, the expediters, architects, and everyone else, it seems it's going to pass. That's everyone's best guess at this point in time. And it's going to pass early this year. So, yeah.
All right. So to close things off, once this is passed, any ways to get around these things? Any hacks, I guess you can say? I guess we didn't talk about an ADU. Is the ADU also included in the 6,000 square feet?
No, so ADUs are not mentioned in the ordinance at all, which means that you can build and as you know, depending on the type of ADU and the size, that square footage of the ADU does not count toward your RFA. So you could potentially increase the total square footage of what's built on your property using an ADU, but you're limited, right? So I think it's for detached ADUs, detached ADUs, you can build up to 1,200 square feet, which is sizable. However, that counts toward your RFA, so that's not good. You can only build up to 800 with an attached ADU, and that does not count toward RFA. So that's great. That's another 800 square feet. So, it does matter. You add on the 1,000 square foot basement, 800 square foot there. But if we're comparing the 6 to 7,000, 7,500 square foot to the 10 plus, they're different. They're kind of apples and oranges, right? Yeah. And of course, as an architect and designer, I tend to believe quality over quantity. So I don't really, personally for me, I don't care if a house is big as long as it's really well designed. But of course, this is LA. When we talk about these mansions, it's 10 plus. Like 10 is a minimum, right? It's 10 plus. It's 5 cars minimum, right? There's these minimums. And so with this ordinance, yes, you can use ADUs, attached or detached, and kind of add on bits here and there. But if we're talking about these large scale developments, not the same thing.
Yeah, it's not going to make a big difference. Yeah. Anything else to circumnavigate this once it's happening, or once it's happened, it's like, good luck. You're going to have to hire somebody to help you, try to get a variance on it.
The latter. I think maybe going back to my point about quality over quantity, if you're talking about a custom house and it's for you to live in and it's not a spec house to be sold to the market, then there's even more emphasis on that, right? Like we can make a 7,500 square foot house feel amazing and feel large. It'll feel palatial for sure. And I think, so there's a bit maybe for folks who are looking to do a custom house that they're going to live in for, full time, there's maybe a bit more solace with that because we can make it more about the quality. But again, if you're talking about the breaking point between the numbers that we're describing, then it's going to be tough. Yeah.
Well, I mean, look, I guess to close this out, when I first started doing real estate here in LA, at least was in 2009, there wasn't a lot of spec developers building these mega mansions. That wasn't really a thing. It became a thing maybe in the mid and then like in the teens, 2014, 15, where you started seeing these just enormous properties in the Hollywood Hills and Bel Air. Well, Bel Air always had the big mansions. They're known for that. But like in Beverly Hills, like Truesdale Estates, you see some big properties, but they're not massive properties. Yeah. Now, I think right now in the hillside communities, at least in the Wildlife Ordinance area, the houses that have the largest square footage is Bel Air, Hollywood Hills, and Beverly Hills Post Office, right? Which includes Beverly Park, which has some massive houses there. But I think in the past, that wasn't a big thing. But now we're just kind of used to more and more space, just American way, right?
Yeah. More
so now we'll have to just kind of think of, getting it smaller or buying a house, south of Hollywood Boulevard, Sunset, or north of Valley Vista, and I guess maybe some other streets on the other side of the hill, or west of the 405 in Brentwood, in Palisades.
Yep.
You know, so I think those areas are going to be affected in a positive way.
Yeah.
Because at least for the developers, you know, people are always going to develop, right? I mean, they'll find a place to go develop, and also the areas that are in the flatter areas will also go up in value because now they're not looking in those hillside areas with the views. So the areas in the wildlife ordinance are not only getting hit by this, but they're also getting hit by the insurance, which I'm sure you probably, you know, you've heard of in the news a lot, is those areas in the hillside are getting hit so hard with insurance that those property values are not going down because of insurance. So they have that, they have the mansion tax, they have the wildlife ordinance. So, you know, it is what it is.
Yeah,
it is getting tough. Yeah.
And that's why it's also the game is to avoid as much as possible, right? And if you know something's coming up, just slip in before you even have to worry about any of this stuff. And at least give yourself the freedom to build bigger if you want to. If you have a property and you want to build and you're not sure that you need to go that large, but you're like, no, if I can, I'd like to, and you're about 80% certain, like that's what I would do, then, buy yourself that hall pass and have it in your back pocket and use it if you need to. And again, when this comes to pass, the properties who have that, you're in a better state because no one else is going to have that unless they've slipped in before it happened. It's interesting. It's interesting.
Yeah. We'll see what happens. I mean, it's only time will tell. I mean, same with the ULA. It's only time will tell. And with time, we've seen that it's really affected the prices in those areas that have, houses that are on average more than $5 million. Yeah, it's been, it's definitely hurt those areas a lot. All right, cool. Well, thank you, David, for hopping on and talking about the wildlife ordinance. How can people reach out to you?
We have an Instagram, which is fame_architects, and we're on YouTube. We have a website also, which is famearchitects.com, and they can find me on there. My email is david@famearchitects. So I'm pretty open about communicating, and I love answering questions and helping people. Even if we don't work together, it doesn't make a difference to me. So reach out and I can talk. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thanks, David, for joining. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Paul.
All right, man. See you.
Later.